Also thankful we got some heat. I thought we were going to have to declare this a casual meeting so everybody could go get their sweatshirts and scarves if we did a repeat of the morning. We'll get started in just a minute. All right, thank you, everybody. I'm Adam Nowalski. I'll be chairing the meeting. Ashton Harp from staff next to me. This is the Tautog board. We'll start out with the approval of the agenda as provided. Are there any changes to the agenda as it's been provided? Is there any objection to approval of the agenda? Seeing none, the agenda is approved. The proceedings from the August 2016 board meeting were provided in the meeting materials. Is there any objection to approval of those proceedings as provided? Seeing none, those proceedings are approved. Next agenda item is public comment. Is there any public comment for items not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move along. Next order of business will be to review the 2016 stock assessment update, and for that we'll turn to Jay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My name is Jason McNamee. I work for the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. I will be going through the regional and coastwide update assessment results for Tautog. There's a lot here, so I tried to keep it pretty formulaic for each region. I've got the same set of slides, so when we go through the first time, I'll take my time on the graphs and kind of explain what you're looking at, but then I'll speed up or else we'll be here all afternoon. And just before I get going, I just wanted to make a quick comment. This got turned around really quick, and I just was really impressed. The assessment team, there were a whole group of us that worked to get all this stuff done in time for you to take a look at. So very impressive to get a full update assessment done in a couple of months. Okay, so just a quick overview of the presentation. We'll go through region by region with the assessment results. I'll go south to north just to shake it up a little bit. Probably confuse everyone, sorry. And then we'll end up with the coastwide, and we're just showing that. I actually kept that section really brief, and we did it for continuity and for context, so that's in there as well. And so for each region, I'm going to hit data, the time series that we're working with. We'll look at harvest and fishery independent and dependent index information, results, and then the biological reference points and stock status. So that's kind of the formula that we'll go through for each region. A couple more general comments. Once the regional structure was determined, which you all did, I think, at the last meeting, we basically followed the format and the structural elements that were approved through the benchmark. So not a lot of surprises here. You've seen all this stuff. It was an update, so we didn't veer too far from the benchmark assessment that we had put together a few months back. So these approved elements were all applied to the appropriate regions, and we were consistent with a couple of the metrics, specifically natural mortality, the plus group that we used, the selectivity functional form, and the discard mortality rate that was consistent across regions. All right, and just a look at the regional structure. So you can see the different regions are colored here. So the blue is Mass and Rhode Island. That's the MARI or the MARI region. The green is the Long Island Sound region. So that's New York, the Long Island Sound inside section of New York and Connecticut. The orange is now the New York, New Jersey, I guess, what are we calling it? The New Jersey, New York Bight region. That's the orange color, and then Delmarva is in maroon down below, just to give you a kind of a look at where the regions break out. Okay, jumping right in, Delmarva. This had the shortest time series. It went from 1990 through 2015. Recreational discards was also 1990 through 2015. And a note, and this is the same for all of the regions, so the recreational discards are based on the B2s from MRIP, and then only 2.5% of those are assumed to die. So just so you know, it's not the entire released portion, it's only 2.5% of those that end up being a removal. Commercial harvests from 1990 through 2015, again, consistent across the regions. Commercial discards are not included in the assessment. We did some sensitivities with that during the benchmark, and it was found to not have a significant effect. So we stayed with that for the updates. For the Delmarva region, there was no fishery independent survey data. So what we are relying on to tune the model in this region is a MRIP CPUE, and it's not a simple calculation of taking the harvest divided by recreational trips. It's based on there's other forms of this. Jacquard index is another form of this, but you basically try and look at all of the species that are caught on a tautog trip kind of consistently, and you look at it not just directed tautog trips, but any trips that caught your suite of species that routinely get harvested with tautog. The idea there is to get some zero trips in your calculation. So that's what the MRIP CPUE is. Each region has an MRIP CPUE specific to that region, but Delmarva, that was the sole source of kind of tuning information for the model. And then there's also FI is fishery independent, FD is fishery dependent biological samples that are used in the stock assessment. So the first chart here that you're looking at is just some harvest information. I'm going to laser beam the screen over on my left, so sorry folks on that side of the table. So what you're looking at here, this is total removals up on the top, metric tons along the y-axis, year along the x-axis. The big kind of darker, I shouldn't even say that though, actually lighter blue color is recreational harvest. Up above that, you can kind of make out a darker blue, that's recreational discards. And stacked on top of that you can barely see is the commercial harvest. And down below is just a proportional representation of the same information. So what you can see is as the harvest declines, the proportional contribution of these different fishery elements becomes more significant, more important. And here is the MRIP CPUE that we were talking about just a moment ago. So this is kind of your abundance index through time. Again, fish per angler trip along the y-axis, year along the x-axis. The dark line with the open circles is the actual point estimate year to year, and then it's bounded by the dotted lines, which is the 95% confidence intervals. And so you can see kind of a period of high abundance, but also high variability, and then in the most recent years, kind of declining. All right, here are model results. So top left is information on fishing mortality. The gray line is the actual point estimate as determined by the model, and then superimposed on top of that is what we use to actually determine stock status, and that is the 3-year running average. We do that, we have a recreational, a high component recreational fishery with Tautog. There's high variability in the harvest estimates from year to year, and so we get wild swings in F because of that. And in an effort to kind of dampen that a little bit, what we've done is superimpose the 3-year average, and we talked about that during the benchmark process, but that's what the black line is. It's just a running 3-year average of fishing mortality. And so you can see fishing mortality in that 2010 period of time was pretty high, but has declined dramatically since then. Just to the right, but still on the top, sorry, Ashton, I just laser beamed your head, is information on spawning stock biomass. So spawning stock biomass in metric tons along the y-axis, year along the x-axis. Again, same setup. The line with the open circles on it is the actual estimate bounded by the 95% confidence intervals, and this is kind of a consistent signal. But you've got a period early in the time series of higher abundance and a period of lower abundance, and you can see for Delmarva it's actually declining in the most recent years. And then this very bottom graph here is recruitment, and so this is millions of age 1 fish along the y-axis, year along the x-axis, same setup as above, the point estimate with 95% confidence intervals. So you had a really big recruitment event here early in the time series, dropped off, then you had a period of decent recruitment in the middle of the time series, dropped off again, and some recovery in the most recent years. Just another important note is you can see for recruitment, as you get into that terminal year estimate, there's less information for the model to work with when it's estimating that recruitment estimate. And so the confidence intervals get wider, sort of common amongst statistical models. Okay, biological reference points. So for the Delmarva region, MSY-based reference points were deemed unreliable. There was steepness estimated at, for all intents and purposes, 1. So there was a poor fit to that spawner-recruit relationship. So for this region, we defaulted to SPR-based reference points. We set the target and the threshold, the target at 40% SPR for F4 SSB, threshold at 30%. These are all consistent with the benchmark determinations as well. And so what you see in the table here is your F value at the threshold is 0.24. There's your threshold spawning stock biomass level, and the same information for the target down below. Here are a couple of charts that show you stock status on the next slide. And so the red on both graphs, so up above you have fishing mortality, down below you have spawning stock biomass. Your threshold in both graphs is the solid red line, target is the dotted line. And then here is your F estimate. We saw that already, and you can see it is right on top of that F target for the Delmarva region. So that's F on the y-axis, year, down below SSB on the y-axis, year along the x-axis, and you can see the trajectory of SSB. There's your threshold, there's your target. SSB is well below that on the bottom, and so the result of that, the terminal year estimates for F is 0.16. So again, that's right at that target level. SSB, however, in the terminal year is about 620 metric tons, 621 metric tons. So stock status in Delmarva is overfished, but overfishing is not occurring. Okay, so that's the same setup for each of these. I'll do less pointing on this one so we can move through this in a timely fashion. So for the New Jersey, New York Bight region, recreational harvest, we've got a little bit longer of a time series here, not much, but this one goes from 1989 to 2015 for the harvest, the discards, the commercial harvest. Here we have a couple of fishery independent sources of information. We have the Western Long Island Sound Seine Survey and the New Jersey Ocean Trawl. Those are our two indices. The Seine Survey is an index of recruitment, and the New Jersey Ocean Trawl is represents adults, so it's sort of a full population set of information for that one. Western Long Island Sound, you're going to see that twice here, and you might wonder why. We were able to kind of break Western Long Island Sound survey into two of the regions, and so I'll talk more about that when we get to the next area, but this is the portion of the Western Long Island Sound Seine survey that is outside of Long Island Sound. Again, we have fishery dependent information here, MRIP CPUE, and we have fishery independent and fishery dependent biological samples. Harvest information, again, pretty variable year to year, but again, I think the take-home points for these graphs are, by way of removals, the recreational fishery is the vast majority of all the removals. And you've got this trend across the regions of higher removals early in the time series and lower removals later on. Here's a look at the Western Long Island Sound Seine survey. So again, this is a recruitment index. So you can see there are these periods of good recruitment kind of followed by periods of lower recruitment. Good news in the later part of the time series, you've got a couple of good years of recruitment in there. Here's the New Jersey Ocean Trawl, so pretty variable relative to some of the other trawl survey data sets we have in here. So it starts off kind of high, drops down, then jumps back up in the early 2000s, and then, I don't know, it's variable, but trending down slightly since then. And then here's the MRIP CPUE, same sort of thing. It's kind of high in the very earliest part of the time series. It's low, and it jumps up there in the late 80s, and then it's been kind of on a downward trajectory, but pretty shallow trend there. Okay, result information again. Fishing mortality, top left, your left if you're facing the screen. And you can see that fishing mortality was kind of low in the middle of the time series there and has risen in the most recent years. The past 2 years it was kind of lower and then went up a little bit, so a decent signal there at the end of the time series, some lowering of fishing mortality. SSB starts off high and then drops down to this kind of stable low, maybe a little bit of recovery there at the tail end of the time series. And then recruitment, you can see that good recruitment event at the end of the time series. Biological reference points, again, this region, there was no good fit for the spawner recruit relationship, so we defaulted to SPR based reference points. Same target and threshold levels here. Here the F at the threshold is 0.34. SSB at the threshold is 2,351 metric tons, and the target's 0.2 and 3,154 metric tons. So stock status, the terminal year estimate, this is the 3-year smooth average, is 0.54 for the New Jersey, New York Bight region, well above both the threshold and the target for fishing mortality. So it is overfishing is occurring. And then the bottom graph there is the SSB information, and that is below both the threshold and the target. So overfished and overfishing is occurring for New Jersey, New York Bight. Long Island Sound, so as we kind of go up the coast here, the time series of information that we were able to use gets a little longer. This one goes from 84 to 2015, and I think the constraint here was the length of the Connecticut Trawl Survey. And so the 84 through 2015 was what we used for all of the fishery-dependent information, recreational and commercial, and now we've got a few more fishery-independent sources of information. So this is the portion of the Western Long Island Sound Seine Survey that is inside the sound. And they broke that out by stations and where the stations kind of fall. The trawl survey in this region is the Connecticut Long Island Sound Trawl Survey. That's a full age spectrum. And then the New York Peconic Bay trawl is also used for this region. That is not a full age spectrum, though. It is only age ones. We kind of peeled out the age ones from that survey. And this also has an MREPC PUE index in it. Harvest information, again, looks pretty similar to what you've been looking at. Higher harvest early in the time series, drops down. Here in the Long Island Sound region, it's jumped back up, highly variable year to year, but it's jumped back up starting in the 2000s. But again, I mean, it oscillates pretty dramatically from year to year. Here's the Western Long Island Sound Seine Survey. The gaps are years when the survey stations inside Long Island Sound weren't conducted, so those drop out of the index. But you can see that information. You had some good recruitment events early in the time series, and then maybe a good recruitment event there in 2015 looks a little bit above average there. The Connecticut Long Island Sound Trawl Survey starts high, kind of drops down, get a little recovery in the early 2000s, but then has dropped down to a low stable level at the tail end. And Peconic Bay, again, remember this is a age one only, and you can see that series of good recruitment events there at the end of the time series. MREPC PUE, high early on, and then declines to a pretty stable and low level in the most recent years. Model results, so fishing mortality from 84 to about the mid-90s, fishing mortality kind of increased, and then it dropped back down in the early 2000s and has risen again starting in about 2008. Got pretty high. It's been variable year to year, but it's kind of in this stable high area. SSB, high in the beginning, drops down. There's a period of recovery there in the middle, but since it has dropped back down and is sort of stable, slowly increasing in the most recent years. And then recruitment, again, there was some high recruitment events early and then some decent recruitment events at the end of the time series. Okay, so Long Island Sound, we had a decent fit to the spawner recruit information. And so what the technical committee chose to do with this region was to use the MSY-based reference points. The estimated steepness, I think, for Long Island Sound was around 0.5, maybe a little lower than that, but it seemed like a reasonable, the fit seemed reasonable, and the estimated steepness also seemed reasonable, so we used the MSY metrics as our preferred. But we're also presenting, because this question came up the last time we talked about this, we're also presenting the SPR-based reference points just for context, and so that you all can discuss that later. So the MSY threshold is 0.49. The SSB threshold, these are the MSY reference points. The SSB threshold is 2,148. The MSY targets for F is 0.28, for SSB is 2,865. And then down below is the SPR calculation. So the threshold, 30%, SPR threshold F at 0.46, SSB at 2,238, and the target at 0.27, SSB at 2,980. And so for the Long Island Sound region, there's not a big disparity. Certainly some differences between the MSY calculations and the SPR calculations, but not that big of a disparity. Here is a look at stock status. So your terminal year estimates, F, the 3-year average F is 0.51. SSB is 1,603 metric tons. So if you look at the top graph there, for fishing mortality, you're just up above both the threshold, you're just up above the threshold and well above the target. SSB down at the bottom, and so important note on these graphs, I'm only showing, again, I was trying to be efficient with the presentation, and so this is the MSY calculations. In your documents that you all have, you can look at, we created these charts for the SPR as well, so you can look at those if you're interested, but I'm just presenting the MSY reference points in this slide. So, sorry, I'll jump back. Fishing mortality is above the threshold. SSB is below the threshold, so this region is overfished and overfishing is occurring. Okay, last of the regions. Here we have the longest time series, 1982 through 2015 for recreational and commercial fishing information. We also have a couple of fishery independent sources of information. We have the Narragansett Bay Seine Survey, which is an index of recruitment. We have the Rhode Island trawl, and so we use the fall Rhode Island trawl information. And then we have the Massachusetts trawl, and for the Massachusetts trawl, we used the spring information. These are both seasonal surveys. Again, we have an MRIP CPUE and fishery independent and fishery dependent biological samples. Harvest, so you can see some really high spikes, which kind of skews the graph on the top of total removals. That really high spike kind of, you know, skews your eye a little bit away from the fact that harvest is pretty high early in the time series and has been lower since then, with variability year to year. And again, proportionally, you can see one kind of interesting note here is the recreational discards have increased beginning in the 90s, more or less, through time. You can see that in the proportional chart. So here's the Narragansett Bay Seine Survey. You had some, I'll call them above average recruitment events early in the time series. And then in the early 2000s, we had a decent set of recruitment events. They since have tailed off with perhaps a good, I'll call it an average recruitment event in the very last year. Here's the Rhode Island trawl survey. Again, some large spikes in the beginning, kind of, you know, doesn't allow you to see this trend very well, but it's high early in the time series and kind of declines, probably not shockingly. The Massachusetts trawl survey, same thing, some high, very variable years in the beginning and then drops down, kind of low and stable. And then the MRIP CPUE, same sort of thing. So 3 sources of fishery independent information, all kind of indicating the same thing. Model results. So you've got a period of increasing fishing mortality early in the time series, kind of peaks in the 90s, and then has been declining since then. Spawning stock biomass starts off high, declines pretty quickly, and has been low and stable since about 2000. And then recruitment, again, you can see there were some decent, good recruitment events early in the time series, a couple of potentially average recruitment events, but the model is not estimating that big spike of recruitment that you'd see in that Rhode Island index in that last year. The Mass Rhode Island region, again, we preferred the MSY-based reference points. but I'm again showing the SPR reference points for reference. Here, if you look at the threshold and the target, F is 0.28 for the threshold, 0.14 for the target. Pretty big spread between the target and the threshold based on the MSY calcs. The SPR calcs just below that, the target is 0.28, so the target is where the threshold is for the MSY calculations. And then 0.49 is the threshold for fishing mortality. And then the SSB metrics to go along with those for MSY, you've got 2.7 thousand metric tons for the threshold, 3,631 metric tons for the target. If you look down below that, the SPR, the threshold's at 2,000 metric tons more or less, and 2,684 for the target. So here's a look at stock status. So the 3-year average F for the Mass Rhode Island region is at 0.23, tucked right in the middle there between the target and the threshold. And then the SSB is down below. You can see we are and have been below the SSB threshold since actually 1996. So stock status in this region, overfishing is not occurring, but it is overfished. An important note, I should have said this when I was talking about Long Island Sound, the stock status for Long Island Sound does not change if you switch from MSY to SPR calculations, but it does change for the Mass Rhode Island region. Okay, so again, I wanted to hit a couple of slides here on the coastwide model results. So if you remember back years ago, wasn't that long ago, we were assessing this stock on a coastwide basis despite all of the biology and the things that we knew about it, but we didn't have much of a choice. And so we wanted to just show you for context and give you some continuity with what we used to do in the past, but not a lot of shocking information here. So top left, fishing mortality, you can see fishing mortality kind of rose early in the time series, dropped down to kind of a median level in the middle there, and then rose back up later in the time series with potentially some lowering of fishing mortality in the most recent years. Spawning stock biomass declines down to a low stable level, and recruitment seemed to be good early in the time series and less so later in the time series. Here we are able to calculate both MSY and SPR based reference points. So for F MSY, the target's at 0.17, the threshold's at 0.24, SSB targets at 14,900, SSB thresholds at about 11,000 metric tons, and then the SPR calculations are below that. The threshold is at 0.43, the target's at 0.25 for fishing mortality. It's at 9,448 for the target, 7,000 more or less for the SSB threshold. In the graphical look at stock status, where we're looking at this along the entire coast again. F in the terminal year, 0.38. SSB is about 6,000 metric tons. So on the graph, you can see F is well above both the target and the threshold, and is well below on the bottom there, the target and the threshold for SSB. So overfished, and overfishing is occurring if we looked at it as a coastwide stock unit. Overfishing status changes with the SPR calcs for this coastwide view of this as well. Here's a table of the overall conclusions. I think what I'll do is I won't dwell on this for long, but I can come back to it. Maybe I'll hover on this as you begin your deliberations. In any case, we can always come back to it, but it just gives you the overall view for the 4 regions. All of the regions are overfished, but so that's with regard to spawning stock biomass. And then for the fishing mortality information, Delmarva and Mass, Rhode Island is not overfished. New Jersey, New York Bight, and Long Island Sound are overfished. One thing I didn't put in any, we did some sensitivity testing. I did not put any retrospective charts or anything in here. They are in your document, but just kind of two high-level thoughts. The smaller regional scale continued to hold up with the updates, so it worked for the benchmark. We all cheered, and it held up for the update, so we cheer again. Seems to be working. We have enough information to run these regional models, which is good news. And the models are robust to input data and model configuration based on some of the sensitivity analyses that we did. Okay, so I'm going to conclude here with some projections. So the assessment team performed some short-term projections. We projected into 2016 through 2020. We wanted to do this to provide the board with some additional information for your deliberations. We ran 3 scenarios. We didn't go crazy here. So we wanted to just give you some ones that we had heard you talk about in the past. And then for context, we did status quo. So we did a 50% and a 70% probability of achieving the F target in 2020. And then we ran the what would happen at status quo if we ran that out to 2020. The biological parameter assumptions that we made was for maturity, natural mortality, weights at age. Those are all the same as were used in the model. The one difference is for the weights at age that goes in as a time-varying matrix. So we used the average of the latest selectivity block for the weights at age. That's how that went into the projection model. A couple more things, a couple other assumptions. Empirical recruitment drawn from the model estimated observed recruitment was used for the SPR calculations. And then for the MSY calculations, we used a Beverden-Holt model. And the parameters were those as predicted by the model. So that's how we kind of informed the projection model. Those parameter estimates came right from the model, and we used a log normal error distribution for the projections. Fishery selectivity was input as that estimated by the model in the most recent selectivity period, so that last selectivity block was carried forward. The harvest for 2016 and 2017 was assumed equal to the most recent 3-year average harvest. So that's an important point. So I'll get into more of that when I jump into the tables, but the tables will make more sense to you if you keep that in the back of your head. So 2016, we don't have that number yet, and we assumed that we wouldn't be able to get management in place for 2017 either, and so what we did was we used a 3-year average harvest for those 2 years based on the previous 3 years where we had information. And then we used an iterative process to determine what the constant harvest rate in 2018 to 2020 would need to be that would result in a 50 and then a 70% probability of achieving the F target. So here are the projection results. This is the Delmarva region. So that, again, I'll explain this table a little bit. So you've got your scenarios here on the left-hand side, probability of being at or below the F target in 3 years, so that 2020 year, that is this middle column. And then we also put in the probability of being at or above the SSB threshold in 3 years as well. So you've got all of that information for context. And so again, status quo is 77 metric tons for the Delmarva region. That has a 100% probability of being at the F target in 3 years, and an 18% probability of being at or above the SSB threshold. Now this is where it gets weird, and why I wanted to make that point on the last slide. So 139 metric tons would give you a 50% probability of the F being at or below the F target. And the way that works is this 77, there's a lot of variability in the harvest in the Delmarva region. The average is 77, so that harvest can actually go up from that average amount. Hopefully that makes some sense. We can talk about it more if not. And then here, 125 metric tons has that 70% probability of being at the F target and 12% probability of being at or above the SSB threshold. Same table for the New Jersey, New York bite. Here, status quo is 461 metric tons. That status quo has a 45% probability of being at or below the F target by 2020, and an 85% probability of being at or above the SSB threshold in 3 years. So, you know, those terminal year estimates were pretty close to the reference points, and that's why that information is that way. The 50% probability would allow for a 450 metric ton harvest, constant harvest, and then 410 to be at a 70%. So you can kind of judge there from status quo. You'd need some level of decrease to meet those 50 and 70% probabilities of being at your F target. Here's Long Island Sound. There are now two tables. I'm showing you both MSY and SPR here. And so the status quo harvest for the Long Island Sound region is 500 metric tons. Here you get now some pretty severe decreases needed to be at the F target. 264 metric tons, so roughly a little more than half of the harvest that you had from that status quo calculation to get to your F target with a 50% probability, more than half to get to a 70% chance. And it's not much different for the SPR reference points. In the Mass, Rhode Island region, again, even more severe. You have your status quo amount of 390 metric tons to get to a 50% probability of being at the F target, at or below the F target in 3 years. You'd need to have 151 metric tons to be at 70%, 148 metric tons. If you drop down to the SPR reference points, those decreases are less severe than the MSY calculations. So that's it from me. I'm happy to take any questions. I can flip back to any of the information, but that is all of the information from the update assessments for the regional assessments for Tautog.
Thank you, Jay. Those last couple slides were almost as rosy as Shanna's South Atlantic update on funding, so thank you for that. All right, so let me frame the conversation for where we go from here. As Jay gave the presentation on the update, what we need to get through as a board today is provide the PDT with guidance on how to use the information contained herein. Some of the items we need to discuss, for example, include choosing potentially between the MSY and SPR reference points for Long Island Sound and Mass, Rhode Island. The next presentation we go through will have those issues. I believe there's 7 issues that we'll go through that we need to get comment on. So that's what the bulk of what we need to get through today. So if we have technical questions for Jay about the information that he just presented, we'll go ahead and take those. But I think the sooner that we go ahead and get into the decision points, the better. So questions. I had Bill Adler, and then Dave Simpson, and Mark Gibson. Emerson, and we'll start there. All right, so go to Bill first. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. Climate change and the Tautog. I know they basically stay put that's one of the things about this fishery. But do you see, or does anybody think that there's, with all the other fish moving north, that these things might migrate that way too?
Jay?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we haven't talked about that much as far as some kind of movement of the population center northward. What we talk about with regard to climate change and effects on this species is that it's a period of lower productivity, and so I think you saw that in some of the recruitment indices further north. There's been a period of lower recruitment in the most recent time period, so we haven't talked about a shift like we talk about with black sea bass or something like that, but we do we do think there are effects here, and potentially, I hesitate to even use the word, but I'm going to use it anyways, a regime of lower productivity in the most recent years. So that's kind of what we talk about with Tautog. And I'm trying to search in the memory banks here if there's information like we have, from Maine, picking up black sea bass up in the Gulf of Maine. And we don't hear too much of that about Tautog, so I don't have much to offer there.
So I'll just add that I can't comment on the productivity element, but unlike a lot of species we deal with, this species is known to be active across a very wide range of temperatures, up to 30 degrees, in any area up and down the coast between 40 and 70 degrees, they're known to be active. Can't speak about the productivity element that Jay just spoke to. Next on my list, Dave Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a great summary. It's very helpful. I resolved my first question while Bill was talking. It's 0.6% probability of being above the threshold, not 60%. I was having trouble with that, but I resolved it. The other, in the report, I could not find for Long Island Sound the stock recruitment plot. If you could just add that, that would be great. Eric provided it for me, via email, but I think those are really helpful, and he went to the extra step of labeling each point by year, which helps me with how variable recruitment might be at a given biomass. So that would just be a really helpful addition. Thanks.
Mark Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also noticed that the Long Island Sound information was missing, so I support Dave Simpson's request to include that, given that there was some determination of reliability. My question is about the multiple methods of calculating reference points, the SPR-based ones and the MSY-based ones. And I don't know if you have the stock recruit plot for Mass, Rhode Island, but it's a pretty unusual one. And I'm intrigued by what Mr. Adler said, because it looks like a stock that could be undergoing a change in productivity. There's a period of time in high recruitment and then a fairly smooth change trajectory downward to a cluster of a shotgun scatter at the end of the trajectory downward. But it looks to me like there would be strong time residuals in this stock recruit pattern. I'm interested in how the determination is made as to what's reliable or not within the catch and age model. But I may have more to say after Jason answers. I may have more to say about it when you get into the issues for the PDT development of the document. But I'll just ask. I guess the question is what's the basis for at the technical committee for determining what's a reliable stock recruit component in this model or not?
Jay.
Yep, so it was, I'll offer that this was a topic of pretty intense discussion, as you can imagine. And so for the MSY calcs, it was kind of an accumulation of a couple of things. First, just the statistical look at it from the model, was able to estimate a reasonable steepness, and we judged reasonable based on the value that came out of the steepness estimation, along with what that value is for other similar species, and it seemed, again, reasonable in that regard. And the other thing that we noted was the MSY information seemed to get more statistically reliable for the areas that had a longer time series, and when you had that fishery independent information back in the time series, early in the time series, that was the other kind of indicator. You had that for Long Island Sound and Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and you didn't have it further south. That time series truncated, and so I guess it was an accumulation, a weight of evidence kind of approach that we used. But again, I think you haven't actually said anything. The implication is this was not a no-brainer for us. We talked about it a lot, and so that's where we ended up, was relying on those kind of pieces of information and saying it looks like a reasonable curve. I will acknowledge, though, that we did not talk about that temporal aspect of it and didn't review that, in our deliberations.
And just to add, just to add to Jay's answer, we also did some sensitivity runs with the model, and a lot of times what you'll see is that steepness estimates will jump around a lot, and the model won't have a good ability to fit the steepness, but we didn't see that with the Massachusetts, Rhode Island, that the estimates of steepness were coming out in roughly the same spot for different sensitivity runs, so we had more confidence in the model's ability to actually pick up some kind of relationship there.
Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Jay, for your presentation. My question was similar to the one that Mark had, but kind of to follow on that. So then, when you're able to have confidence in the stock-recruit relationship, the TC is recommending an MSY approach. Is that correct? And then when there's low confidence in a stock recruitment relationship, the TC is recommending the SPR relationship. That's part one of the question.
Jay?
Yep, that's exactly right. And so there's a parameter that estimates called steepness, and so it was kind of able to give a reasonable, it was I think in the vicinity of 0.4 for the Mass Rhode Island, 0.5 for Long Island Sound. But then when you went south, that steepness parameter ends up being 1, so basically saying there's no relationship that the model is able to determine. So that's exactly it. Because there's no stock recruit relationship, you're not able to calculate MSY for those other regions.
Emerson, you had a second question or a follow-up to that?
Yes, follow-up. Thank you. So then if I understood your response to Mark as well, then, the TC speculates that the reason that you don't have confidence in a stock recruitment relationship for those two areas that don't have it is because of the time series of the data. Is that correct? Thank you.
That was a nod of the head, Jay, for a yes answer.
No, I was just waiting for the okay to answer. That is one of, that's not the entire reason. That is one. That is, in fact, I will say that's conjecture from me personally. We didn't actually talk about. We did. Okay. Go ahead.
Sorry. So yes, I think that is one of the things that we noticed about the time series is that the two more southern models with the shorter time series don't really cover that early part in the early 80s where we think that exploitation really started to peak. So it covers what we think is maybe a more lightly exploited part of the population, and thus you have better contrast between the high SSB and the low SSB, and therefore the high recruitment and the low recruitment. And so that gives the model a better ability to fit a relationship if a relationship is there. So with the short time series, you're not really seeing that strong, what we think would have been the peak of biomass in that region if it had been available for us to model. So we think that is why the relationship isn't coming across as strongly in those two southern regions as it is in the regions with the longer time series that cover more of the contrast in the population.
Okay, so we've got about 45 minutes. Are there any other questions on the presentation, or are we ready to delve into the issues we need to get some feedback from the board on? Okay, seeing no hands on questions, we'll turn to Ashton to begin the presentation. And again, we've got 7 items here. After each item, we'll stop, get feedback from the board, with the exception of 1 item with regards to the tagging program, where we've got a few extra slides. So we'll just bring that up, but we'll hold off on feedback until the end of the other items when we've got some more information for the board. Ashton?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, so the PDT has been working hard over the last year on developing the background sections in Draft Amendment 1, and so we have those together, and now what we want to move forward with developing is the management options now that we have the stock assessment update for the regions as well as the coast. So I'm going to walk through 7 issues today, and as Adam mentioned, I'm hoping we can stop after it's just 1 or 2 slides for each issue, and then we can stop and have a discussion and hopefully come to a decision point at the end of each one. The first 3, the reference points, projections to reduce F, and the rebuilding plan, you can refer to your guidance document. I've kind of given a little bit of background in there, and you can already see the pointed question that I'm going to ask. For the latter 4, the commercial and recreational split, the commercial harvest tagging program, commercial harvest quota, and management within a region. These have been brought up at the February meeting earlier this year, but I know that this will be, it'll sound like new information again, so I'm just going to ask some pretty pointed questions related to these topics. So with the first one, reference points, this is a table that can be a little bit confusing, I know that. So it shows the 4 regions as well as the coast, and it shows the MSY and the SPR reference points right next to each other, so you can kind of see them as a guide. The TC is recommending, as we just discussed in detail, MSY reference points for Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Long Island Sound, and the coastwide in the coast. SPR reference points are shown for New Jersey, New York Bight, and the DMV. So I've tried to simplify this table a little bit just to show what it would look like and how it would look to the public if we went out with just the TC recommended reference points. This is what they would see. The next slide. So this is what they would see. They would see simply the reference points that the TC has recommended. Is a simpler way to look at it. The PDT would prefer not to go out showing MSY plus SPR reference points because it is quite confusing, as well as it'd be confusing to develop management options for all of them as well. So that gets to the question. So does the board approve the reference points as recommended by the TC, meaning the MSY reference points for Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Long Island Sound, and the coast, as well as SPR reference points for New Jersey, New York Bight, and the Delmarva regions?
Okay, well, I think we've jumped to the big one pretty quick, so let's get right down to it. Questions, discussion. We need to provide some guidance to the PDT on what they would like in the draft amendment. Dave Simpson.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a tough question. Fortunately for Long Island Sound, there isn't really much difference at all in terms of what it means, but there's a significant one for Rhode Island and Mass, and I think it'll be up to them to find a comfort point. It's basically how much do you believe that there is a stock recruitment relationship and it looks like this versus time period periods of high and low productivity. I personally think there were signals in all those assessments that recent recruitment is improving. So I think there's a environmental element to this that may be more important. I'm also looking ahead to, I think it's a shared concern, but it's the last point that Jim Gilmore made, which is when we start to put these pieces together, we want to try to look as seamless as we can between regions, have as similar rules as we can between regions. And so that's again where we may, we may want to try to smooth some of this stuff out. I guess I'd want to hear more from Rhode Island and Mass what they think about the differences, because the biggest difference is there. And is that just because, well, why is that? I'm just very skeptical of stock recruitment relationships. I think, well, it sort of goes back to Mike Sissenwein's work on yellowtail flounder. You know, he published his thesis just in time to have the stock recruitment relationship hold, and then the next year it fell apart. So they're elusive. My inclination coming into the meeting was I did want to defer that decision until after the public had had a chance to see it. We've had a chance to look at what it would mean for management. So there's a little bit of a practical element rather than a pure objective process that I'm looking for.
So before I go to Mark, who I had next on my list, the goal for each of these would be to try to develop some consensus around the table for how to proceed. In the event that we can't develop a consensus, the default would be to include them both, at least on this topic, and that might change as we go through each other topic. Might be some different outcome by no consensus, but that's essentially what that would mean. Unless some board member had some specific motion on one of these matters that they wanted to bring forward. But that's the course that we would be going here as we go through these speakers. Mark, had you next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess in answer to the question, I would answer no. I hate to do it, but I don't approve either reference point for, at this point, for I'll stick to the Mass Rhode Island region, although my concerns may apply to the other regions as well. It looks to me that there is evidence of non-stationarity in the population dynamics. That is, we have a period of time of relatively low recruitment going on. So that challenges both MSY reference points because there's a stock recruit calculation that's not stable with respect to time, but also the SPR, since you're drawing randomly from the recruitment distribution, you're giving equal likelihood for the big ones occurring as the small ones occurring. That may not be the case. I'm concerned that we have estimated biomass targets and thresholds that are unattainable in either calculation. That the differences in stock perception in Mass Rhode Island notwithstanding between the two methods. I don't know where to go with that from here, because putting them both out there for public comment under those criticisms, I just have a concern about that. But I don't know what the alternative is at this point. The horse seems to be out of the barn relative to the technical merits of either one of them.
So where we go is we hopefully provide guidance today, then the PDT comes back with a draft amendment at February, or would it not be till May? February most likely, at which point we would then decide whether or not to keep the horse out of the barn or some other action at that point. So next up, Dan McKiernan.
Yeah, I agree in large part with Mark, but my question is how negotiable is the rebuilding time frame? Because we may find that there are real benefits to creating some common measures among the areas if it meant extending the rebuilding time frame for one of the areas a little longer than another. If we're all in the same time frame and it drives us to have different management measures, it could be problematic, especially the I'm thinking, and I talked to David Simpson earlier, a Montauk-based boat coming to Block Island is going to have to comply with the Mass Rhode Island rules, so it would be really beneficial to the extent that we can make these rules as common as possible if it means the negotiable part is the rebuilding time frame.
So to date, I believe what we've looked at is just the date selected arbitrarily. I'll turn to Tony, though, for specifics on what we might need to do with this stock.
This is an amendment document, so the board has the ability to change the rebuilding timeframe from what was in the original document to the degree that you want. And I don't even know if the original document had a rebuilding timeframe, but off the top of my head. So it's the pleasure of the board to develop a rebuilding timeframe.
So the
Ashton.
rebuilding plan is issue number 3, and so I was going to get to that one. And the reason why I brought up the reference points first is because everything builds upon that. And I have 2 presentations, multiple different presentations that were developed based on the decision that you guys made here today, so it became more streamlined. But so there is no rebuilding plan in the original FMP from 1996. There's nothing that says if the stock is overfished that you must do X. It's not in there. The PDT would like to propose something like that, and I am going to ask some pointed questions under issue 3 regarding that.
So one option right now would be to leave all of these options in here, MSY and SPR for the coast, or take one out for the coast if you wanted to, as opposed to leaving it in Long Island Sound, Mass Rhode Island. Obviously creates more work for the PDT, but when we see those options come back in the draft amendment, we would then have the ability to decide if we wanted to take them out. So we'd have a second chance to potentially take options out before they go out to public. Obviously, in deference to the workload of the PDT, they would provide we take out anything that we can here. So let me phrase it at that point. Is there anyone who supports not having the PDT move forward with working with all of the options that are here, which would be MSY and SPR for Mass Rhode Island, Long Island Sound, and the coast, and SPR for Delmarva and New York, New Jersey? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone who supports taking any of those out, so that would be the current direction to the PDT, leaving them all in. All right, so Ashton, follow up to that?
So just to clarify, even for Long Island Sound and the coast, people do not feel comfortable choosing MSY or SPR reference points. Is that? Because, I mean, it could have one region, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, where it's unsure MSY and SPR would go out, and then the other ones would have been chosen. It doesn't have to be every region has multiple options. I just want to bring that to their attention.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anybody jumping at trimming that workload, unfortunately. Joe?
Thanks. I mean, just to put this out there for the discussion, there's as Jay mentioned, the coastal was there to show continuity runs. So going back further than reference points, do the coastal options have to be there at all? That's my question. We did a lot of work to move past that. You know, does that have to be part of the public document? I'm just going to put the question out there. Thanks.
Well, I certainly think it's a good question, given this board did vote to move forward with the regions. Jay, do you have any other thoughts about the merits of including those options?
So, yes, I do. We didn't. We did the work for the coastwide, again, to provide that continuity, but I would suggest that all of the reason why we did this whole exercise with the regions is because none of us are very comfortable that this is the assessment for this species should not be smeared across the entire coast. It should be as regionalized as possible. I think we've done that, and so I would suggest that going with the regionals and not the coastwide would be, you know, the preferred way to go. We've got the information there. We could carry forward the coastwide, but I don't see a lot of value in it from a technical standpoint.
Ashton, do you have anything else to add? Okay, so do I see additional, is there any objection to not having the PDT develop management options based on coast-wide reference points? Dave?
I don't have an objection because I don't think that's where we'll go, but don't we need a status quo option for the amendment? And whether we could satisfy that with one of the two reference points for the coast. I'm not sure well, that's my question. Could we get away without having that default coastwide?
Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There doesn't necessarily have to be an explicit status quo option in there, because essentially don't approve the amendment and you revert back to the current management program, and that's your status quo. So it's up. It just depends if you want how you want to illustrate the effects of not moving forward with the amendment, but it doesn't have to be in there.
All right, so again, I'll ask, is there any objection to not having the PDT move forward with management options for the coast? Okay, so we can remove a couple options from the PDT workload. Jay?
Yeah, I'm sorry if I thought I was tracking this. So I just wanted to clarify for Delmarva and New Jersey, New York Bight, was there a request to add back in MSY calculations for those regions, or are we comfortable with the SPRs given that we can't estimate a stock recruit relationship for those two regions? I just wanted to clarify because I thought I heard both things.
So I haven't heard that specific request. Where I believe we are right now is SPR for all 4 regions and MSY for Mass, Rhode Island, and Long Island Sound. And seeing no objection to that from the board. All right, let's move on to the next set of options.
Okay, so now we're moving on to issue 2, which is the, oops, let me get my slide here, which is the projections to reduce F. So as Jay presented in the stock assessment update, the TC did perform 2 analyses, the 50% probability of achieving F in 2020 and a 70% probability of achieving F in 2020. So I have 2 slides on this. So this first slide shows just the MSY reference points, and the second slide will show the SPR reference points. So the 2 columns on the right are the maximum removals if the 50 or 70% probability is chosen. The 2 columns on the left show just for comparison, what were the landings using the 3-year average, and what were the 2015 landings. So we can just move to the next slide to show just the SPR reference points as well. There's not too much of a difference between them. There's actually not too much of a difference between the 50 and the 70% in most cases. Does the board have a specific opinion on choosing either 50% probability of achieving F in 2020, or would they be more comfortable using a 70% probability of achieving F in 2020?
Okay, thank you. So that's the question. Do we want to include 50, 70, or both, or potentially something else that we haven't been presented with, which I don't think the PDT is looking for, but so those are the options, 50, 70, or both in the document. Discussion? Emerson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In order for me to have a response to this, I think we need to have some discussion about timeline. Because if the timeline changes to something different in 2020, then a response to a 50% or 70% probability, at least in my mind, may be different. Thank you.
Dan?
Yeah, I would prefer the more liberal value, and the reason is there's other sources of mortality that I don't think we're going to be able to measure very well that we want to resolve in this fishery. As you know, there's a tagging program being talked about for the commercial fishery. When our law enforcement finds instances of poaching in Tautog, they are spectacular numbers of fish. So the fear is that there is there really is an unknown amount of landings that a lot of people are very interested in resolving and are willing to put a lot of work into it. So I really don't want this to be measured by legitimate landings as to whether we're going to succeed or not, because success in conserving Tautog is going to come not only in the measured catch but the unmeasured catch. And I'd also like to point out that in a survey or in an experiment that we ran in Buzzards Bay with ghost lobster traps, Tautog was the #1 fish that was captured and were probably killed in abandoned lobster gear. And we need to resolve those. Granted, there's less lobster fishing, less lobster traps going on in southern New England than there was in the past, but that's another source of mortality that hasn't been measured. We need to work on better ghost panels. We need to find ways for lobstermen to be losing less gear. We have a regulation, an obscure statute in Massachusetts that in some areas around the Elizabeth Islands, lobstermen have to fish single traps, which probably results in more lost gear. So those are two sources of mortality that I want to resolve going forward that aren't going to be necessarily measured if the metric is documented landings. So I want the more liberal target.
So you're saying Tautog needs to be considered in other boards as well. All right. So when you say you want the more liberal, you're looking for the more liberal landings number, which would be the smaller percentage of F target. The 50% is what you'd be looking at. Okay, got a thumbs up for that one. Okay, so we've got one comment in favor of including the 50% only. Any other comments? Joe. I'm sorry, I had Russ first, Joe. Go ahead, Russ.
Well, I don't know. It may help us all because I just had a question for Jay, actually. So, okay, thanks. On the projections, is this where 2016 and 2017, that assumption that 2016 and 2017 are playing into this? Is that correct, Jay?
Jay?
Joe, I didn't catch the very end, but I'm going to assume you were asking about, so 2016 and 2017, we put in assumed harvest that's equal to that average, that 3-year average harvest from the last 3 years of known information.
So, and I guess my question would be, since, it is so, the MRF estimates are so variable, if 2016 turns out to be very different by the time this document hits the public, is it possible that these projections would be off? Would it impact the projections greatly if 2016 isn't, we're assuming 2016 is going to be like 2015, if I'm correct, and if we realize by the time this document hits the public that that's not the case. Am I following that, and is that going to have an impact?
Well, I think it's going to be at the discretion of the board how quickly they want to move with the draft amendment itself. We'd had the timeline that allowed for this last round of an assessment update to give us these numbers. If we wanted to wait for further landings and request this type of update again, I think it's just going to further push back the timeline. Good? Okay. Russ.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand Dan's concerns, and I agree that that's something that should go out for public comment. But I believe, since the work's already been done for both of these, that they should both be considered in the document. As we talk about the timeline and how everything's going, and as the landings come in for 2016, we'll have a better idea of where that fit into all this. So I'm comfortable with both of those, since the work is already done, going out for public comment. But no, I don't think we should have any more options than that.
Okay, so we've got one comment for 50 only, one for both. Dave Simpson?
Yeah, I think I'd still like to see both and extend that projection out to see when we get to the place we want to be with SSB. So you have it out to 2020, but if you strung that out to 2025, you know, are we there in 10 years or that sort of thing? Is that much more difficult to do?
I think we would just want some guidance in terms of, do you want to see a set timeline, like where would we be in 2025, or and when do you want like a 10-year rebuilding, a 15-year rebuilding? Do you want to get to 50% probability of being above the SSB threshold? Like, these are all different options that we could show you, so I think having some guidance in terms of what exactly are you looking for would reduce the workload on us a lot.
Yeah, and you know, what we're looking at with these numbers here in terms of removals is based on achieving the target by 2020 right now. That was the projections that have been worked on so far. The PDT can work with a different date if we give that to them here today.
Right, thanks. So for the Mass Rhode Island area, holding landings constant at 257 metric tons, different fishery, gives you a 50% probability by 2020 of reaching your target F. I guess what I'm looking for is, and given that, and if we held those landings constant, I guess I'd just like to see it out to where SSB stabilizes. So it's the population has adapted to that lower level of F, and what's the timeline to get there? So the public would have this sense of, if we fished it, you know, this level of removals for the next 10 or 15 years, this is where we'll end up. 2020 is kind of an interim look, but where will it take us long term, I think, is what people would want to know.
So I think if I recall the presentations correctly, for most all of the regions, we're at a stable, or in some cases slightly increasing SSB at our current level of removals, but that is far below our target SSB. Correct. So I'm not sure. We're pretty much there now at stability. So the next level would be.
And so the target and the threshold have been set up so that if you fish at the target over the long term with our assumptions about recruitment, you would get to the SSB target eventually. And I think your question then would be, when do you get to that target? And so I think we can figure that out. And so, and again, with assuming you would want maybe a 50% chance of being at your SSB, the SSB threshold, you'd probably hit the threshold obviously before you'd hit the target. But we could, if that's what you're interested in, we could provide those projections. It's obviously a different set of projections to say, in 10 years, where will we be, versus going through the kind of the iterative process of where would we end up with a 50% probability. So
I think Dave's request is whatever we wind up choosing here for projections, you'd like it projected far enough out to show it when it would reach the SSB target.
I think so, but I don't want to ask for more work than, you know, than is necessary. I'm not sure how much work I'm asking for, but sort of that restabilize, as you say, you might be able to just answer it. It'll be 15 years before you restabilize at a new number, given the age structure and so forth, and that might be the answer the public needs, but
Right, so I mean, we can't tell you that now because we stopped the projections in 3 years, and you saw where you ended up. But that is something that we could do, and it's not a ton more work for us. I just want to be careful that as we go down these lists and start adding things on top of that, can you prioritize some of these tasks for us and give us really clear guidance in terms of, you want to see, so, and obviously there is if you fish at the 50% probability of reaching F target, that's going to may give you a different timeline than the 70% target. You're going to also have different timelines if you're fishing at the SPR and MSY reference points, and we'll have to do those. If you give us a firm timeline of we want a 50% chance of being above SSB threshold in 10 years, then we have to, that's additional work to go through the iterative process to figure out this is the amount of landings you need to maintain to get to your threshold in a set time, which is different than the projections to do if we keep at this level of landings with the F target value, then where do we end up in the long term? So, and it's not to say that we can't do these, it's just that the more specific we can be, that will really cut us down on the amount of work that we have to do. So thank you.
Mike Luisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Forgive me, I'm trying to process what was just said there. It was a lot. But let me ask my question, and maybe I'll think that through. And this is to either, I guess, Katie or Jay. Am I understanding the connectivity between timeline and percent probability in such a way that, and I'll just refer to the Delmarva 50% probability of achieving F at 139 metric tons. So that is, if we were to harvest at 139 metric tons, we have a 50% probability of achieving the target by 2020. But if we were to change that timeline and make it 2025, does it increase, would that same catch level, because of the downward trend that catching 139 metric tons has on F target, does that ultimately turn into more like a 70% probability if you extend the period of time for which you're fishing at that level? Are they connected in such a way that that's how it would go? Are you increasing your probability at fishing at a constant level that is an attempt to achieve the target if you extend the period of time for which you're doing so? I hope.
Jay?
Yeah. So I think, the most direct answer, Mike, is we'd have to run it and see, in particular for Delmarva, when it's we're using an SPR calculation, it's just kind of, after a certain amount of time, you kind of hit this equilibrium because it's just sampling out of that recruitment vector that's in there. So it, eventually everything just kind of stabilizes. But I guess I'm trying to think back to these plots, and I think the 139 does increase. So if you then took and stretched the time period out, I think it would in fact create a more optimistic probability. But it, how optimistic, we'd have to do it to tell, but I think in general you can make that statement. It's a little less clear with the MSY regions because now there's a relationship in there that's at play. But I think as a general statement, I think keeping things with these numbers that you're looking at up on the screen, if you then stretched it out, it would probably increase the probability that you reach your goals.
Bill Adler?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was sort of watching that myself as far as everybody else is reducing and Delmarva is going up. And I was just curious as why they go up, everybody else goes down. That's fine if it works, but I was just thinking in terms of even if it just stayed status quo, wouldn't it be without any increase at all down there? Wouldn't that improve the probability higher than 50 or 70? What I got stuck on here was that they had 77, they caught 41, and they get to go up to 139, which is fine. I mean, I'm not against that, but that just caught me right there, and I don't know why.
So one of the things we talked a little bit about status quo earlier, the first two columns in this table would likely be included in the draft amendment, or one of them, or that would be I mean, I think you want to at least include that information for public consumption.
There's no reason why you can't include the two left columns in there. It's just historical information for comparison purposes.
And then it would come back to the board whether or not the Delmarva region actually wanted to pursue an increase in landings, and it would be up to the board how to address that request. So we're still at the question of 50, 70, or both. Dan, let me ask you at this point. I've got 2 in favor of both. Do you remain opposed to both? Okay, I have a no. So where that would leave us is including the 50 and the 70%, and again, we would have the 4 regions, but not the coast-wide projections, and that would include SPR for Delmarva, New York, New Jersey, and both MSY and SPR for Mass, Rhode Island, and Long Island Sound. Okay. Moving on to the next topic.
Okay, so issue number 3 is a rebuilding plan, and we've already kind of touched on this a little bit as, how far or how long will it take for SSB to, hit the threshold. So right now, as you can see, and for actually quite some time, all of the regions are overfished, as you can see in the red numbers, or actually, sorry, I was looking at the wrong one. So all of the regions except for the SPR reference points for Massachusetts, Rhode Island are considered overfished. And so so then the question is, does the board want to establish a spawning stock biomass rebuilding plan? It's not currently in the FMP. As Katie said, if you do want to task the TC with this work, we have some pointed questions for you. Specifically, should we build to SSB target or SSB threshold? What would the rebuilding time frame be? Should it be 10 years? Should it be 15 years? What should the probability of achieving SSB threshold or target, whichever you choose, would it be 50%, 80%, 100%? These basic questions will need to be asked before the TC can begin work on a rebuilding plan if that's the will of the board.
So Ashton, if the answer to the first question of establish an SSB rebuilding plan is yes, you need answers on all of these today before you could complete a draft amendment to bring back to the board. Okay, so you know what's before us now. Thoughts on a rebuilding plan? At present, there's none specified in the Tautog management plan, which gives the board, quite frankly, a lot of flexibility on how to proceed. Mark Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would argue against establishing a rebuilding plan at this time. Given the remarks I made earlier about my concerns about the stability of productivity, I think we could get trapped into a place where we can't get to. We've had a lot of experience with rebuilding plans at the New England Council. Many of them we can't get to. We can't get there from here. So I would argue against that at this time. Perhaps in another action following a benchmark, we might want to reconsider, but I wouldn't argue for it. I would argue against it now.
So in terms of actions moving forward, a rebuilding plan would require another amendment, or could that be done through some other type of shorter timeline management action? Tony? In the event that the board does not move forward with initiating a rebuilding plan in this amendment, can a rebuilding plan only be initiated through an amendment, or is there some other management process the board could pursue, an addendum or something, to initiate one in the future?
If you include a rebuilding timeframes in the items that are frameworkable or adaptive management in this document, then you could do a rebuilding timeframe through an addendum. But currently, I do not believe that that's an addendable issue, so we would need to make sure we included it in the amendment.
Okay, so that actually adds a third option here. in addition to yes or no to the rebuilding plan, include the ability to initiate a rebuilding plan through adaptive management, if I heard you correctly. Okay. Dave Simpson.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Make it easier to do if we decide down the road we want to do that, but I'm kind of with Mark that we're better off focusing on getting F to the target and keeping it there, and then nature gives you what it gives you, rather than, rather than the speculation that goes into where we can get with SSB with changing productivity of stocks.
So the two options then that would be in the amendment would be status quo, no rebuilding plan, and the other option would be a rebuilding plan could be an option under adaptive management. Any objection to that? Okay, great. Bullet point number 4, Ashton.
Okay, so we're making some progress here. So item number 4 is commercial recreational. And so what I'm specifically getting at here is, as we've seen throughout the data, is that the recreational sector contributes a large portion of the harvest, and I've broken it down here by region. And this is over the entire time series of data that we have. This represents the recreational and commercial split. However, if you were to slim that down and only show data from 2010 to 2015, you'd have pretty much the exact same numbers. So it's been this way for quite some time. So the board could consider having one sector take a greater reduction than the other, and if they want the PDT to look at this and include it as a management option, then you can let us know.
Okay, so do we want to differentiate in reductions between the recreational and commercial sector, or would the reductions come equally? Dave Simpson.
Or potentially alternatively leave it to the jurisdictions how they want to achieve their target F and their package of management actions.
So where would that fall as an option here? If we didn't specify in the amendment, would that not be the default way for the states to proceed?
So that's the last item that I was going to address with the board, is it's kind of management within the region, and how do we want to do that? Does it want to be state by state, or does it want to treat it like one region where all cuts are taken together and you would take the same cuts together? So we could fold this discussion into more of a regional management discussion if you want to take it out by region. I understand if you do.
So you're suggesting holding off on completion of the discussion of this item until we get to number 7?
Right.
Okay, any objection to that? Okay, so we're going to temporarily skip 4 and move on to 5, which we're going to temporarily skip also after Ashton just gives a brief overview of it.
It's going to move right to the end. No, so item number 5 is the commercial harvest tagging program. So I would just want to go through the options with you. And I also want to say the tagging program is underway. So that it took a little bit of time because we are working with Stony Brook University, which is very nice to work with us on this project, as well as New York DEC. And so we had to do some ethical handling protocols for dealing with live animals and other things that kind of delayed it. But it's underway now. The fish are tagged. So I'm going to present a separate presentation that'll show the tags on the fish. I know everyone kind of wants to see what that looks like and how they're doing. And just note that the full project report will be presented at the February meeting. So I know it's a little preemptive for me to be asking you these next questions, given that you haven't seen the full project report. But I'm just going to give them to you anyways, and then we can kind of have a discussion about it. So for draft amendment 1, the board can request the PDT to, similar to the rebuilding plan, just include text under adaptive management that allows a commercial harvest tagging program to become available to be developed at a future date via an addendum. So just be a little text in there that says it can be developed as an addendum at a future date. The board can ask the PDT to develop management options for a comprehensive harvest tagging program. So even though we're not sure if we want to move forward with that, the board can just say, let's just develop management options for it. Or the board can say that they don't want to include the commercial harvest tagging program. We've had second thoughts, and we don't want it to be under adaptive management. We no longer want to consider it. So with that, I will we're not going to have a discussion now. I'll have the presentation at the end of this presentation, and we'll come back to it.
Okay, let's move on to 6.
And so this is the reason why I put the tagging program kind of in the middle of the document, is because I thought it did relate a little bit to a commercial harvest quota. One could say that this might be a regional decision as well. So the question is, should each region and or state have a commercial quota? A commercial quota may be useful if a tagging program is implemented. It would be, then we would know how many tags are needed. So the options to consider if a quota is considered regionally is, you could have a regional quota, which is common pool. So if you have 3 states and all 3 states are going after the quota, and whenever the quotas hit, the fishery would shut down. You could divide the quota equally between the states in a region, or the quota could be allocated, the regional quota could be allocated to states based on state shares. How we do that, if it's historically, if it's politically, if it's all the ways that were discussed yesterday, there's many ways to allocate the quota. That would need to be discussed by the board as well.
Okay, so thoughts about a commercial quota? Dan?
I can't imagine this plan finishing up and not having a commercial quota. What is the vision of this fishery at the end of the day, especially with the very involved and possibly expensive tagging program? It seems to me that you only need a tagging program if you're trying to constrain catch to a level and make it accountable. We have to have a quota.
Steve Hines?
I agree we need a quota, and we're probably going to end up with state-specific quotas, but I also think that that's been a little bit problematic for us in the past. And in order to get at the quota, it's almost like a catch-22. I think if we implemented a tagging program without a quota, you wonder how many tags you're really going to need. But if you implement a tagging program, I think you're going to eliminate a lot of the illegal commercialization, and maybe some, I don't know. I'm going to reserve. I do believe we need a quota overall on the coast, but this is going to be problematic for us.
Any other hands? All right, I got a bunch here, so let me see a bunch of hands that want to speak. 1, 2. Okay, we'll start with Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As far as tagging goes, I think we absolutely have to have tagging. But as far as the methodology there, I'm uncertain whether or not it should be dealers are tagging the fish or fishermen are tagging the fish. I have some reservation about that. As far as quotas go, I mean, New York, if it's a regional basis, New York will get 2 quotas. Is that correct? Because you got the Sound and you got the coast.
Ashton?
It's a good question.
So I have some concern with that because it's not very far from the south side of Long Island to the north side of Long Island. So.
All right, let me go to, I know your question's not answered. I'll go to Dan and then John Clark.
Yeah, just for the record, Rhode Island and we have quotas already.
John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We just have standard regulations for commercial or recreational, and I believe that's similar to Maryland. And if we do go to a quota system, if that was kept as an option to just maintain recreational, well, universal regulations for recreational and commercial catch.
Dave Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Don't we have a 4th option that the states within a region could, by mutual agreement, share the quota? In other words, come up with whatever the sharing formula is. Isn't that another option?
So we have the regional quota there. How is that different than the sharing of the?
Well, the second part of this, the way I understand it, is how you share, right?
So the first option would say the region has a quota. When this region's quotas hit, all states stop fishing.
Right.
The second option would say give a region a quota, but then divide that quota amongst the individual states to then fish as they so desire.
But the second one, maybe I'm reading this or not understanding it properly. The second one says equally.
Correct. So if there were 3 states in a region,
They all get 1/3.
correct,
Okay.
which is different than the last bullet point, which would be some other allocation formula.
Okay, but that's, okay, so number 3 covers my point then.
Mike Luisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I understand why there'd be certain states and certain regions feel that there's a need for the tagging program, a tagging program. In Delmarva, as Mr. Clark just mentioned, our commercial limit is the recreational limit. We don't have a commercial fishery. So I would, it's just one more thing. A tagging program would just be one more thing, another permit, another coordination to try to get tags to folks who are going to bring 2 fish home during the summer months and 4 during the winter months. I just wonder if moving forward there could be some form of an exemption to the tagging program if a state has the same bag and size limits for its commercial fishery that it does for its recreational fishery. Almost like a de minimis as it relates to the tagging program. I feel like it's going to be more effort on the state's part to implement that program than it will be to benefit the resource.
So let me pose this question to staff input from the PDT. I believe that, as with most of these issues, the board's going to want to see what do each of these bullet points potentially mean for my state. If we just gave you an answer today of the board wants to institute a commercial quota, what additional guidance would be needed to start developing some of these options to bring something back to the board in February? Is that enough information, or do we need to delve deeper into these today?
Well, we would need to go back to that, the commercial and recreational split to see if there needs to be a greater reduction from recreational versus commercial. So that question would definitely need to be answered. And then just the third bullet item, if we're going to allocate a regional quota, which could be an option in the management document, it would be helpful to have some kind of thinking on how you would like to allocate that. Do you just want to use historical landings and the PDT can come up with different years to show historical landings? Or is there some other way that you would like to allocate a regional quota?
Okay, so I'm trying to keep us on track here, and we've kind of taken 2 items, 4 and 6, and there's certainly an understandable need to consider them both together, but it's making it a bit difficult to answer either question. So let me go to Joe, who had his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also want to remind everybody that through addendum 4 and 5, we had to come back with addendum 5 because certain states were saying their commercial fisheries were also, going back further, addendum 4 was saying that we were going to reduce F in this fishery by only taking cuts in the recreational sectors coast-wide, and then coming back and saying some states needed to do something with their commercial fisheries. So I have a concern, I guess, and it may not even be part of our region, but with allocations being based on years where certain states knew that their commercial fishery was part of a problem, and maybe that wasn't the case for other states. Thanks.
Okay, so pretty much every speaker I've heard no one speak against a commercial quota. So I think we'll direct the PD. Okay, I'm not sure all right, so we'll hold up on that. Roy, you had your hand up.
I think the Delmarva region's kind of in unanimity
then a commercial quota is not needed for our region. Thank you.
So an option to move forward with would be a commercial quota in only certain regions, which is part of item 7, which we would discuss next, correct?
Right, I mean, we can include the commercial quota option. I can take it out to public comment in that region, and then if it overwhelmingly comes back that you do not want one, then it can just be striked from the record, and then that region would not have a commercial quota.
Wilson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question. So, and this relates to the tagging program and to, if I'm remembering correctly, law enforcement concerns that prompted consideration of that in the first place. So even if you do have a situation where you don't have commercial fisheries in place within a given region, if you don't put a tagging program into place coast-wide, does that leave you open to the possibility that then you've created a loophole, you know, in your enforcement program? I would defer to law enforcement to answer that question, but it does seem like that would then create a potential outlet for continuing some of the illegal harvest issues that we're trying to address in the first place.
Dan, I had your hand again.
Yeah, I agree with Wilson's comments. I want to recall the discussion of that law enforcement subcommittee we had about the need for tagging, and I believe there were some Delaware enforcement officers who did express concern that fish were being harvested and sold, and they weren't being accounted for. So it seems to me another option should be, and to satisfy Mike's concern, if a state has the same commercial limit as their rec limit, then maybe they're talking about no commercial sale, because if you're going to condone commercial sale that are going to be untagged fish, it completely undermines our concerns that there's a lot of fish leaving our states and going over state lines into these markets, especially in New York, and we just have this fear that it's a big sinkhole of mortality. So if you're really going to manage this thing with a common limit, then you essentially have game fish, which maybe ought to be an option up here, to have no commercial fishery.
All right, let me turn to law enforcement for a moment regarding the discussion about a commercial quota in one region but not others, or in all but one region. Let me get their comments first.
So the way I see it, if you don't have a quota, that's fine, but every fish that goes to a commercial market, if you're going to have a tagging program, needs to be tagged for consistency. The tagging program is going to flesh out the black market fish, with there being a potential for fish to get to market that don't have to have a tag because they're from one of the states that doesn't participate in the tagging program. That defeats the whole purpose. The idea is you have people who are not commercial fishermen who are selling large quantities of fish, and the idea is they will not have access to the tag, so the fish that are in the market are all going to come from a commercial source, and that's going to protect our commercial fishermen.
Okay, so the comment from law enforcement is that a quota would not need to necessarily be instituted in all regions, but there would need to be a uniform tagging program.
That's correct.
Okay, John, then Mike Luisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the problem we've had in the past with the TOG mostly has been from recreational fishermen. And I think if markets can only sell tagged fish, obviously fish that a commercial fisherman in Delaware catches, for example, wouldn't be able to go out of state without the tag. But we could also institute something, perhaps dealer tagging in the state, where we could track the tags that way. I mean, I think there's options we could do where we still don't go to a quota and just have our recreational possession limit for our commercial fishermen.
Mike?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the comments, and I was thinking a little selfishly just about the administration of a program that, you know, would require more resources than you know, the benefit, but not thinking outside of our region. I certainly understand the need, and you know, we would be committed if a tagging program is ultimately determined to be something that this board wants to put in place. We'll figure something out in order to make sure that we're doing our part to help with the problems that exist. Thanks.
Tom?
I couldn't let the comment go by. It's not recreational fishermen, it's poachers. Yeah, I mean, this is, you know, we keep saying that it's not recreational. Anybody that's hook and line selling fish illegally is a poacher, not a recreational angler.
I'm sorry, Tom, I misspoke. I meant poacher.
All right, so let me do this right now. Let me ask Ashton to give us some guidance on what answer she specifically needs from us on this today. The goal was to bring back a draft amendment for the February meeting. The timeline for 2018 implementation could have that draft amendment back in May and still meet 2018 implementation, but we would need to find some way to get through these issues. One way would potentially be to take them all back, think about them, and just bring them back up for discussion again at a February board meeting. I'm not sure we would make tangible progress. Another option would be some type of working group to address it. Okay, but let me ask Ashton what answer she would need and to go back to the timeline here.
So just thinking about the next issue, which is management within regions, and you know, really starting to manage this fishery within regions, it seems like maybe 3 regional working groups might be helpful. And I'm saying 3, not 4, because I'm thinking of Massachusetts, Rhode Island as one working group, and then the Long Island Sound and New Jersey, New York Bight as one working group, working together, at least in the beginning, on how we manage that fishery. And then the Delmarva working group kind of working together as well. Because I realize, I mean, we don't want to have the same management coast-wide. That's not really the goal. There's different stock status coast-wide. So maybe working together in small groups might help us get to where we want the regional management measures to be within each region. And they can be different across regions, and that's fine.
I mean, clearly the New York, Long Island Sound commercial issue is a large one in how they would deal with a commercial quota that would potentially pull from 2 regional quotas. So let me hear thoughts about regional working groups. I saw some heads nodding that I think we're in an up and down yes direction. I'm getting some thumbs up. I think we're getting consensus. So what those regional working groups would specifically work on would be items 4, 6, and the one we haven't seen yet, which was 7. If you could just pull 7 up for a moment so we could take a look at that. And that would be the management within regions. So I'm still seeing heads nodding. Now, if we pulled that together, we would then get input from that, discuss it in February here at the board, and then give that to the PDT for further development. In the meantime, the PDT could, if they so choose, work on the items we've passed on so far for development. Okay. I saw Joe's hand up, and then I'll come to Bill Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had one question, well, I guess a 2-part question. One, has the AP weighed in on any of this, and are we envisioning them as part of these working groups? Thanks.
So who we put on the working group would be at our discretion. Typically, I think the AP would get the draft amendment when we sent it out for public comment, and we would get their formal report at that point. Tony?
We actually do engage in the draft, the AP, before the draft goes out for public comment, but we would need at least a substantial draft to engage with them on, and I don't think we're there yet. So you could either include them in the working group or wait until we have a little bit more meat on the bones, and then we can engage the AP as a whole.
What I will offer, Joe, is with some of the tagging work, we did reach out to them at that time to get some feedback as we were going through that process. So they have been engaged on parts as we've moved forward, and that would be a good suggestion. I had Bill Adler's hand up over here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, in the process, the development of a draft, if it's an amendment, would actually be developed, would it not be development of a PID first? As amendments usually go that way. A PID that goes out, then comes back, and then we do the draft amendment and proceed from there. I think that's the process. The second thing is, I just wanted it noted that I don't know if quotas are adopted, if there's a provision in, or there would be a provision in an amendment for a transfer of quota. If we go that route, if there is a quota, because I know some of the plans have transferability, others don't, and I just would think that if you could put, if something in the document would allow for transfer of quota, if there's quotas, then at least it's in the document, and we wouldn't have to come back and say, whoa, we can't do that if quotas. So those are my two comments.
Yep, and you're 100%, and the PID that had gone out for Tautog helped get us to this point so far to keep us focused on these issues as the ones that we need to develop in the draft amendment. So we're good with going ahead with some regional working groups. Do we want to get members here today, or do we want to form those afterwards? What's the thought of staff? Okay, so what will happen is staff will follow up with the individual states, and we would focus on the three regions: Mass and Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey, because we've got to deal with the Long Island Sound issue, and then Delmarva, and we would discuss those three issues with regards to the commercial quota, how to deal with potentially splitting it recreational and commercially within each region. All right? We've got consensus there. Bob?
Yeah, I just think, controlling expectations a little bit. I think it's going to be hard to get a final draft for February given the working group structure, and I think we'll carry it as far as we can at the staff level. The working groups will take some more time. MSY and SPR still being in there, is additional options. So, I think we'll work with you, if that is okay with you, Mr. Chairman, and decide what the best use of the board's time will be in February. Is it, is there enough meat on the bones to come back in February and talk about that and refine it some more, or should we skip a February board meeting altogether and just wait until May? So we'll just have to see where we are as the sort of early winter progresses and we get toward February, if that works for you.
So the goal, I think, at this point would be to have the draft amendment in May, not February. And I think the question becomes is, can the regional working groups provide enough information that the board wants that information to go right into the document, or does the board want that regional information to come back to the board, and that would be the meat on the bones potentially in February to meet a May draft? So do we have any thought about whether we want that regional working group information to go right into the draft amendment, or do we want to hear it back and discuss it at the board level potentially in February? Dan?
I suggested come back to this board just so the regions can look over their shoulder and see what the other region's doing and see if we can mesh things up. Otherwise, it sounds reminiscent of the lobster conservation management teams, which has created some pretty wicked chaos in lobster management.
Okay, so assuming that we can get those working groups meet, get the information back, that would be the goal, to discuss that in February. Okay, so let's go back to 5 with the tagging trial, and the question that we want to answer is, do we want to, in the amendment, similar to the previous discussion we'd had, do we want to have the amendment clearly specify and have the PDT develop what the tagging program looks like? Or do we just want to initiate a tagging program and then have it further developed in a future addendum? So I'll turn to Ashton for the presentation on the update of the tagging trial, and then we can try to answer that question as our last item of business today.
Okay, and it's I've brought pictures and videos, so it'll be fairly quick, but just kind of want to put some pictures to this. So the tagging trial has begun. It began on September 28th. So there was 3 tags we were looking at. I mean, originally we started with like 20 tags. LEC looked at them. We narrowed it down to 3 tags. And now, as with any project, it has been narrowed down further to 1 tag. And that is the tag. It's the national band tag. This is actually the one that the LEC preferred as well. It's, I mean, when you put it on the fish, it seems to be relatively easily put on after a couple of tries of, like, once you understand how to use the applicator. We'll have a full project report at the February meeting that will go over that. But if you cannot take it off the fish and salvage that tag. It is not, it's 100% not possible. So that's kind of the main thing that we wanted, and it also allows us to put a numbering schematic on it, as well as the year and the state. So we'd have to give these out every year, and they'd be specific to that state and that year. And so now you can see the fish actually being tagged, and it's Sapercula. There you see now the tag is on. And the last slide is, these are the tanks that the Tautog are in. So there's 15 Tautog that have tags on them, and there's 6 that are untagged for control purposes. And now I just wanted to show a quick video of the Tautog with tags on them. And I just want to thank New York DEC and Stony Brook University for putting this together. You know, they've been great to work with and to get this underway. And so we can replay it like 2 times because it's kind of a quick video. Or maybe you can...
Bill?
Just a question as to where are you planning to put the tag, and in the gills, as you said, or somewhere? And is there any mortality of that fish that you've seen so far?
Ashton?
So the tag was placed on the opercula, you know, right here, in the bony part. And so that's the whole entire purpose of the study, is to gauge mortality. I've not heard of any mortality, but I'm not going to say that there's not, because the full project report will be presented in February. But from what I've heard, they're taking the tags relatively well. And there's no issues to report.
So, Eric, I'll come to you in just a moment. I think what we'll do is we'll just send that video around to anybody who wants it. If we can't get it up, if we can get it up before we get done here, otherwise we'll just send it around. Eric?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are the tags FDA approved?
Ashton?
I'll have to check if they're FDA approved. I was not aware that tags had to be FDA approved, but that does make sense, I guess, for cattle purposes that it is, but for cattle, but I will check to make sure.
So it looks like we've got the video going there a bit. Okay, so you sure? Okay. All right. So that brings us to the question of what do we want to put in the amendment? no tagging, tagging, and we want the PDT to develop all of the specifications for the tagging program, or do we want to have tagging but just allow for future development of that? We did hear from law enforcement that they would want that tagging program to be consistent up and down the coast, so I don't think that would be a topic that we would want to allow the individual regions to come up with the individual ways to go about doing so. So I don't really want to push that off to the individual working groups. So thoughts on those three options: no tagging, tagging fully developed by the PDT as options, or to be developed down the road. Dave Borden, then Mike Luisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support option 2. Been a lot of discussion for a long period of time about the need to solve the poaching problem, and this, we got to be proactive about it and take steps to resolve this, I think.
And that would be fully developing the options as part of the amendment. And, you know, one of the things that we have, what we've talked about now, is putting that off to May. Let me turn to Mike first, and then I'm going to come back to the PDT to ask what guidance they would need to start developing what that tagging program might look like. Mike?
Yeah, I'll simply just say, I think option 2, which would be to have the PDT develop the program, would be the way to go. I think we need to kind of learn from our experiences with striped bass, where states kind of took their own direction on how they were going to apply tags, only to find that years later we were doing addendum 3, which, you know, made everything consistent throughout the coast. So I'd be supportive of option 2.
Okay, so I'll turn to the PDT for what additional advice would they need from the board today to work on those management options?
I don't think we need additional advice from the board today. I need to circle back with the research team and just kind of see how the tagging process went before we could kind of come up with the options. So no other questions today.
So yeah, I think it would be contingent on the tagging team deeming the trial program a success. You know, we won't have that report until February.
And I will also share this with the LEC working group that we've already created, so that'll be shared within the coming months with them, so that'll be prior to the board meeting, so they'll have feedback on it as well.
Okay, so we've got tasks for the PDT, not all of their questions answered, but I think we've at least given them some. Katie would like to add something.
Can I ask for some clarification for a couple of the TC related tasks that are issues that were brought up?
Please do.
So I think Dave had requested the long-term projections of the SSB. So I think what the TC then would go back and do is, for those projections that currently end at 3 years, we would take that metric tonnage that achieves the target, the F target, in the specified time and run that out and then report along. So it would say, like, Delmarva can fish at 139 metric tons to have a 50% chance of achieving the target, and that would achieve the SSB threshold in X years for all of those options. Is that what you're looking for?
Dave?
Yeah, I think that does it. So it's a constant harvest strategy, basically projecting that out. And I think it would be helpful for Delmarva, because I look at the prospect of tripling your current landings, and you can get away with that in 3 years, but can you in 10? I think the public's going to want to know about that. So that's what I'm asking for, and if that's the simplest thing. And the other thing is that I would be happy with just an SPR projection for Long Island Sound, if that's okay with New York. I was concerned about eliminating MSY out of a sense that would put more pressure on Rhode Island and Massachusetts, sort of being the odd ones out. But I think it's easy enough for us to explain for Long Island Sound. They look the same. They're so close to the same numbers. You could expect the same result with MSY if we ultimately adopted that. So I'd be okay with taking that one little task away, from the TC.
And so just one other, I guess, related back then to Massachusetts and Rhode Island had expressed some reservations about all of the options, reference points options on the table. And so I was wondering, are you looking to have the TC develop additional options to address those concerns? Or, I mean, you need to pick something, and what would you like us to do about that?
So where we were before was we had the 50 and the 70% options, SPR for all 4 regions, MSY for Long Island Sound and Mass Rhode Island. What I'm hearing now is a request to remove the MSY calculations for Long Island Sound. Where's the board on that? Is there any objection to removing the MSY calculations as reference points for Long Island Sound? Okay, I see no objection to that. So
To clarify, just for the projections or all across the board, SPR only for Long Island Sound?
I think at this point, just the projections. And we can say, I think fairly, that the outcome is similar, at least in the short term. Again, I don't have a, my only basis for saying I don't like MSY is I just don't believe we're getting greatly informed by the stock recruitment relationship. I'm just skeptical of that, so I just as soon keep it simple and use an SPR, and God knows we've moved our reference points around enough on Tautog over the last, 15 years. So.
Does that answer your question, Katie?
Yes, for that specific question, and then back to, I guess,
so
Massachusetts.
So then we
Rhode
have the second question of additional projections for Mass Rhode Island. We're dealing with the 50 and 70% by 2020 as the 2 that we have right now.
Prior to that, to the reference point specific, which reference point do you want at all? It sounded like Massachusetts and Rhode Island didn't want either of the ones as they have been calculated or presented today. And so I was wondering if there was anything the TC could do to help them make this decision in terms of what reference point they want to see.
Mark?
Well, if I could have my wish list, but I'm concerned about the workload, but I would like to see reference point on the SPR side, computations that perhaps only drew from the most recent 10 years, 12 years of recruitment strength, what that would do, and some thought about the stability. On the MSY side, more analysis of the stability of that SR relationship and what productivity might be now as opposed to averaged across the entire stock assessment data stream. But that's my wish list. I'm concerned about the workload that would require and the timeline impacts on the action. But that's what I'm concerned about right now, is the attainability of those reference points with either calculation.
Well, I'll take it one step further in suggesting that if we open it up to Mass Rhode Island, where do we stop opening it up at that point? Do we start recalculating reference points based on other timelines? I think we have an assessment. I think the TC has already done the work with what we have. I think we, after a lot of debate earlier today, chose to keep the MSY and SPR reference points in as calculated as the 2 options that would go in the draft amendment. I'm inclined, unless the board feels strongly otherwise, to stay the course at this point. Okay, seeing no objection, that's what we'll do, but thank you for that. Is there any comment from the public on anything that we've discussed here today regarding development of the draft amendment? Okay, seeing none, is there any other business to come before the Tautog Management Board this afternoon? Okay, seeing none and having completed the business on the agenda, we stand adjourned. Thank you all very much.
The Summer Founders Cup and Black Sea Bass Board will start as soon as we can turn over, so 5 or 10 minutes. Please don't go far.